Valerie Osei had hosted Sunday dinner at her home in Stone Mountain, Georgia, every week for 14 years. Same table, same cloth napkins, same cast iron pot of soup that had been her grandmother's recipe, adjusted over the years to her husband's mother's preferences. Less pepper, more ginger, because Miriam had mentioned once, in 2012, that the pepper was a little much. Valerie had adjusted the recipe that same week and never gone back. She had adjusted it so thoroughly that she sometimes forgot what the original had tasted like. That is what she was thinking about when she walked onto the Family Feud stage. Not the final Sunday, not the moment she left. She was thinking about the pepper, about how early it had started, the slow replacing, not of the chair, but of the person sitting in it. The cast iron pot had belonged to Valerie's grandmother. Valerie had brought it to the marriage in 2009. Her husband Kwame's mother, Miriam, arrived from Kumasi the following year and joined Sunday dinners within a month. She was warm, she was present, she was opinionated in the way that certain mothers are opinionated, not cruelly, but consistently. And without the awareness that consistency without invitation is a form of pressure. Miriam rearranged the kitchen to be more efficient. Miriam suggested a different detergent for the cloth napkins. Miriam recommended a playlist for Sunday afternoons. Miriam, at dinner one evening, simply stood up and began clearing plates before Valerie had finished eating. And her husband Kwame had laughed and said, "Mama, you don't have to do that." And Miriam had waved her hand and said, "I like to help." And Valerie had sat at the table with a half-full plate and felt, for the first time, like a guest. She said nothing. She said nothing the following Sunday, when Miriam served the soup, Valerie's soup, from Valerie's pot, to the table herself, because she had arrived early and offered to help while Valerie was finishing getting dressed. And Valerie had said yes because she thought it was a kind gesture. She said nothing the Sunday after that, or the one after that. She found ways to be accommodating. She told herself that this was love, that it was love for Kwame, who adored his mother, and love for the family they were building, and that the small surrenders were the price of peace. For 14 years, she paid that price, and every year it cost a little more than the year before. By year 8, Miriam was co-hosting Sundays with Kwame, the two of them in the kitchen together, laughing, running the meal, while Valerie set the table. By year 11, Valerie's own friends had stopped getting invited because the dynamic had quietly rearranged itself, and the Sundays now belonged to Kwame's family. By year 13, Valerie noticed that when she made decisions about the meal, the menu, the timing, the seating, Miriam would consult with Kwame separately, and Kwame would come to Valerie with a gentle counter-suggestion, and Valerie would accommodate it, and nothing would be said directly, and the original decision would simply not happen. She was 44 years old. She had been slowly, graciously, lovingly replaced at her own table. And nobody, not Kwame, not Miriam, not the friends who had stopped coming, had noticed, because it had happened so gradually that there was no single moment to point to. There was only a Sunday in April 2023 when Valerie walked into her own kitchen and found Miriam teaching her youngest daughter, Abina, Valerie's daughter, how to adjust the pepper in the soup. Less pepper, more ginger, the way Miriam liked it. Valerie stood in the doorway and watched her daughter learn her grandmother's recipe from someone else's grandmother. She said nothing. She went to the bedroom and closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed and pressed both hands flat on the comforter, her grandmother's comforter, the one she had brought to the marriage, the one Miriam had suggested they replace because the pattern was dated. And she sat there until dinner was ready and Abina called her to the table. She ate. She cleared her own plate. She smiled. And after dinner, when everyone was in the living room and Kwame was laughing with his mother and her children were asleep. Valerie went to the kitchen, washed the cast iron pot by hand the way her grandmother had taught her. Hot water, no soap, but dry immediately, coat lightly with oil, and she put it in the trunk of her car. She did not say anything that night, or the next day, or the next week. She said something 6 weeks later, when Kwame came to the kitchen on a Sunday morning and asked where the pot was. "It's mine," she said. He blinked. "I know it's yours. Where is it?" "It's in a safe place." He looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze. Something passed between them, not an argument, not a confrontation, but the specific kind of stillness that happens when two people who have been not saying something for a very long time suddenly realize that the time for not saying it has passed. Kwame called his mother that afternoon. Valerie did not hear the call. She did not need to. The following Sunday, for the first time in 8 years, Miriam did not come to dinner. Kwame and Valerie ate alone with the children for the first time in longer than either of them could calculate. Valerie made the soup from the cast iron pot. She put the pepper back. Nobody in that studio knew that the woman who had walked in, smiling, was the same woman who had driven home with a cast iron pot in her trunk. Valerie applied to Family Feud 3 months after the pot came home. She came with her sister Dorcas, her friend Cecilia, her cousin Amara, and her 16-year-old daughter Abina, who had learned, since that Sunday in the kitchen, a more complete version of the recipe. The team was loud and warm, and Valerie was its absolute center, which was exactly where she was supposed to be. Steve Harvey got to her during the family intro and asked her what she did. She said, "Hospitality management, 14 years. He said that was appropriate for a game show." She laughed. Then he asked, "What's the most important thing you've learned about hospitality in 14 years?" She looked at him. She had not prepared an answer for that. She said, without thinking, "That your table still belongs to you even when you forget." Steve Harvey stopped. "Steve Harvey." "Run that back," he said. She said it again. He looked at her for 4 full seconds. Then he said quietly, "What happened at your table?" And she told him, not as performance, not as a prepared story. She told it the way it actually was. 14 years of small accommodations, the pepper adjusted, the friends uninvited, the kitchen rearranged, her daughter learning her own family recipe from someone else. She told it without anger toward Miriam. She said plainly, "She's not a villain. She loves her son. But it was my table, and I forgot that for 14 years. And one Sunday I remembered." And then she said, "So I took the pot." The studio fell completely silent. Then, slowly, and then all at once, the audience began to laugh and then to applaud in a way that is different from game show applause. It was the sound of recognition. Of 300 people who had each been somewhere near this table, in their own version of it, and had never had a word for it until this woman on a game show stage gave them one. Steve Harvey pressed his handkerchief to his face. Then he started laughing too. Not a performance laugh, but the real one. The one that comes from a place adjacent to tears. His shoulders shook. He turned away from the cameras for a moment. When he turned back, his eyes were wet. "I'm going to tell you something," he said. "I was that person once. The one sitting at a table that didn't feel like mine. I was sleeping in my car, showering at gas stations, eating out of whatever I could find. And the thing that kept me going, the thing I promised God if He got me out, was that I was going to spend the rest of my life helping people remember what is theirs, what belongs to them." He looked at Valerie. "That table is yours. That recipe is yours. That pot is yours. And 40 years ago, I was you. a person trying to figure out what they were allowed to keep. The answer is everything that is yours. Stop everything, Steve said. He was not performing now. He was decided. Cut the game. We're done with the game. He turned to the wings. A producer appeared. Steve did not look at them. This has never happened in the 45-year history of this show, and tonight it is happening again. He walked to the front of the stage and sat on the steps and asked Valerie to come sit with him. And they sat together at eye level with the audience, and Steve held the microphone and said, "Tell me what you want the next Sunday to look like. For you. What does it look like?" She thought about it. She said, "The pot on the stove, my recipe, my children at the table, my friends, my pepper." The audience was on its feet before she finished the sentence. Steve stood up and pulled out his phone. He called a family mediation specialist live, a therapist his foundation had worked with, someone who specialized in in-law dynamics and marital renegotiation. He explained the situation plainly. 14 years, erosion of space, recent boundary recovery, a marriage that had survived but needed rebuilding. The specialist said, "I can see this family. I have time. Tell her to call me." Steve said, "She's right here." He handed Valerie the phone. The audience heard her make the appointment. But Steve wasn't done. He turned to the competing family, the Okonkwo family from Houston, a Nigerian family whose matriarch had been visibly nodding through everything Valerie said, and asked them what they wanted to do about the prize. The matriarch, a woman named Ngozi, said in a voice that carried to the back of the room, "Every woman at this table deserves to go home to her own kitchen." Both families received the $25,000 prize. The audience had not sat down. Steve Harvey looked at Valerie one last time, right into the camera, and said 5 words. "Your table, your name, always." He said it quietly. It landed like something permanent. When the episode aired 6 weeks later, it was the most shared Family Feud clip since the previous year's Dorothy Reeves moment. It reached 160 million views in 10 days. The hashtag #YourTableYourName became a rallying phrase across marriage forums, therapy communities, and family discussion spaces. Food writers wrote about it. Cultural commentators wrote about it. A podcast episode about the specific dynamics of in-law household erosion used Valerie's story as its entire first segment. 3 months after the taping, Kwame and Valerie began couples counseling with the specialist Steve had called. They attended for 8 months. Valerie has said only this about it: "We talked about the pepper a lot. And then we talked about everything else. Miriam still comes to Sunday dinners. She comes once a month now, by invitation, and she brings dessert, and she does not touch the soup." 6 months after the taping, Abina, Valerie's daughter, asked to learn the original recipe. Valerie taught her on a Sunday afternoon in November, just the 2 of them in the kitchen, the cast iron pot on the stove, more pepper, less ginger, the way the recipe was supposed to be. A year after the taping, the Table of Your Own initiative, established with support from Steve Harvey's foundation, provides family dynamics, coaching, and domestic space advocacy for women navigating in-law boundary erosion in multi-generational households. In its first year, the program served more than 500 families across 15 states. Today, Valerie Osei hosts Sunday dinners every week. Her friends come back. The cloth napkins are washed with her preferred detergent. The playlist is hers. The soup is hers. The table is hers. It always was. Steve Harvey said in an interview 3 months later, "Valerie Osei came onto that stage with a cast iron pot in the trunk of her car. and the quiet dignity of a woman who had already made her decision. She didn't need me to save her. She had already saved herself. She just needed someone to say, "Yes, you were right to do what you did." The cast iron pot lives on the stove now. It does not go in the trunk anymore. Valerie says that when she looks at it in the morning, before anyone else is up, she thinks about her grandmother. She thinks about the recipe the way it was before the adjustments. She thinks about all the tables in all the kitchens where something that belongs to someone is slowly being replaced by someone else's preference, and how quietly it happens, and how much courage it takes to simply put the pepper back. Have you ever stayed when someone expected you to become invisible? Have you ever made yourself smaller at your own table and then found your way back? Share your story in the comments below. If this moment moved you, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that your name is still on the door. Because your table is yours, and it was always yours.